Hi, I'm Ron Landis. I'm the Raju Professor of Psychology at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my upcoming short course titled Intermediate Regression. So this class, we're going to focus on the use of multiple regression to test a variety of different types of hypotheses that are commonly found in organizational research. The emphasis of the class will be on sort of the conceptual and statistical underpinnings of multiple regression analysis. We'll also talk about how we actually run the analyses, interpret our results, and to some degree we'll talk some about how we present those results or report those results out. My assumption is that people will have had some basic descriptive statistics, so they know what means are, what standard deviations are, what variance is, some exposure to bivariate correlation and perhaps simple regression. I will start off our session with a very brief overview of those concepts just to make sure we're using the same language and talking in the same way about these things. But I really do expect that people have had another course on those topics. In terms of sort of what we're going to cover, the sequencing of topics, we'll start with a discussion of sort of the basic multiple regression model. So what does it mean to include multiple predictors? How do we interpret model fit? How do we specify models? How do we interpret individual coefficients? Essentially, a very fundamental look at regression modeling overall. From there, we'll get into a discussion of the assumptions we make when we run these sorts of models. In particular, we'll focus on what those assumptions are, how we test for violations of those assumptions, and what we might do if we find that, in fact, we have violated any of those assumptions. From there, we'll move to a discussion of different types of predictors that we might encounter. For the first part, we'll focus exclusively on continuous predictor variables, but at this point, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about what happens if our predictors are dichotomous or categorical. So we'll get into dummy coding, talk some about effects coding, contrast coding, the implications for that for our models, how we do it, what it looks like when we use those variables in our models, and again, what that means in terms of model interpretation. At that point, then, we'll turn our attention to the use of regression analysis in tests of mediation and moderation, and even more complex models involving both mediators and moderators. Perhaps at this point I should mention that this is I don't envision this as a class to learn a particular statistical package, but for this part of the discussion, we will talk about using a very popular SPSS macro called Process, developed by Andrew Hayes, to run these sorts of analyses. I know a lot of people are interested in that, so we will talk about it and we'll use that. But I do want to emphasize that our focus will be on building the regression equations independent of using any macros, so that you should be able to take this material and use it in your own work, whether you're using SPSS or R or something else. From that discussion of mediators, moderators, and more complex conditional process models, we'll talk a little bit about what happens when our outcome measure is categorical or dichotomous. So we'll speak some about logistic regression, similarities and differences to the OLS regression models that we talk about through the first part of the sessions, and how we run them, how we interpret them, what they mean. And we'll end our short course by talking some about incorporating terms that account for nonlinearity, curvilinearity in our data, so the use of squared terms, cubic terms, things of that type, for estimating those sorts of models. My hope is that as we finish that material, it will serve as a nice foundation and a segue into a second short course that'll be taught by Jeff Edwards on the use of polynomial regression and response surface methodology as alternatives to difference scores. So the hope will be that you could walk out of our session right into Jeff's session, and hopefully it would be quite seamless. But that's sort of it. If you have questions and you want more information from me, you can get me at rlandis@iit.edu. I look forward to seeing you this summer. Thanks.